Welcome to a Valky, God of Lies deck tech. In this video, you're going to see just how tricky Tibalt can be. Before I dive in, I need to give a special shout out to this video's editor, Chimpy. And if you want to chat with us and our fans, including Chimpy, head over to our Discord, and you can even support us further on Patreon. Okay, let's get into the deck and unpack both halves of this commander. The front side is Valky, God of Lies, 1 and a black for a 2/1 legendary god. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent reveals their hand. For each opponent, exile a creature card they revealed this way until Valky leaves the battlefield. X:. Choose a creature card exiled with Valky with converted mana cost X. Valky becomes a copy of that card. And the back half, Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter, 5 black-red for a legendary planeswalker, Tibalt. Starts at 5 loyalty and has a static ability. As Tibalt enters the battlefield, you get an emblem with, you may play cards exiled with Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. +2, exile the top card of each player's library. -3, exile target artifact or creature. -8, exile all cards from all graveyards, add red, red, red. First and foremost, this commander is an MDFC, meaning that you can cast either side for its respective mana cost. Commander tax will still apply to each side of the card if your commander dies. Valky's front side isn't going to be the main focus of this deck. You actually will get a lot of value from seeing each opponent's hand, and you will end up casting the Valky side a fair bit of the time, but this deck is built all around Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter. The goal is to cheat him onto the battlefield without paying the full 7 mana price as often as possible, and to exile tons of your opponent's cards with his abilities over a few turns by protecting him. Then, through the use of Tibalt's emblem and some other thematic cards in this deck, you'll beat your opponents with their own cards. Before I get into all the awesome ways this deck has to cheat Tibalt into play ahead of schedule, I want to go over the non-Tibalt ways to cast your opponent's spells, since this is an overarching theme of the deck. There are a handful of cards in this deck that will exile cards from an opponent's hand, deck, or graveyard to let us cast later. Gonti, Lord of Luxury, gives you the best card from among their top 4, and is a decent blocker as he has Death Touch. Direfleet Daredevil can steal some amazing spells, and along with Gonti, allows you to cast spells you could never include in your deck, from simple ramp cards like Cultivate, all the way up to crazy game enders like Time Stretch. Keru Mind Eater is an interesting card that was mostly forgotten about since its debut in Commander 2017, but if you can find the open player and connect with it, you do get to take their worst cards straight out of their hand, so they are actually down a card in this exchange. Stolen Strategy is a backup plan for constantly taking things that don't belong to you, since it triggers on each of your upkeeps. Just keep in mind that you'll reveal lands about 40% of the time from it, so it's closer to a draw 2 effect, but the pure satisfaction of using your enemy's spells against them will make up for it. Opposition Agent is here to party as well, ready to give you a complete blowout the turn it is cast, followed by an annoying static ability that everyone else will have to play around. It feels really bad to have your tutor stolen out from under you. Good thing you will be doing all the stealing in these games. Another weirdo card that this deck gets to take advantage of is Dead Man's Chest. It does require a sorcery speed aura attachment, but if you stick it to a threat and then kill it, suddenly you have access to anywhere between 2 and 5 new spells. Then there is Atali Primal Storm, which only asks that you attack with it. Not only are you taking spells, but you don't even have to pay for them, so you're cheating on mana costs as well. Atali is an amazing value engine in this deck and will be difficult to stop once it gets going. The simplest form of card stealing, Praetor's Grasp, is also included in this deck. It's a demonic tutor, but for someone else's deck. One cool side effect of this suite of devious cards is that they can become extremely disruptive in high doses. Continuously stealing cards from opponents' decks or hands will leave them missing key pieces of their strategies, and in some cases, they'll have no way to get them back because you can just choose to leave them in exile if you want. Draugr Necromancer is a brand new card from Kaldheim that fits this deck's strategy perfectly. Killing opposing creatures will give us access to casting them for ourselves as long as we keep the Necromancer alive. As a worst case scenario, it does cause the creature to stay exiled instead of going to the graveyard. We even have a handful of snowlands to be able to cast off-color creatures. Treasure Nabber is a card that had a ton of hype upon its release, but isn't something I've ever found a home for, until now that is. We're going to be sticking a lot of annoying threats with this deck, and opponents will have to be spending all their mana to keep up, which means Treasure Nabber will be stealing a lot of things, even if it's only for 1 turn at a time. It just adds to all the chaos and makes their turns that much more difficult to plan out. Commander 2020 also gave us a nice instant speed way to use our opponent's things against them, Deflecting Swat. You can change the targets for a spell or ability, which could save one of your threats and kill the biggest problem on the board, or even just mess up a critical turn for an opponent by changing a target for their proactive spell to something else. And this is all for 0 mana if you control Valky or Tibalt. These last two ways to fight opponents with their own cards are beefy creatures that can help you beat them down if plan A doesn't go smoothly. The first of the two is Sepulchral Primordial. For each opponent, you can take their best dead creature and keep it with no strings attached. Sepulchral Primordial usually demands a board wipe, and if you control Tibalt as well, wiping the board just ensures his safety. Plus, you'll have already profited from any enters the battlefield abilities the creatures you stole had. Lastly is the biggest, nastiest way to mess up an opponent's game plan, Emrakul the Promised End. She has a virtually unstoppable cast trigger that lets you gain control of an opponent for an entire turn. They get to take an extra turn afterwards, but that won't make up for the damage you'll get to cause. That player could very well be dead if they have a continuous way to pay life, and oftentimes they'll be able to do something annoying like stick their commander in exile or in their graveyard and choose not to place it in the command zone. Emrakul definitely has the potential to win you a game all by herself. Now that I've covered all of the non-Tibalt ways to steal from our opponents and cause mischief, it's time to talk about all of the various ways to cheat Tibalt himself onto the battlefield. This might sound difficult since he starts in the command zone, but we at the Nitpicking Nerds never fail to bring spice to a deck. Our first way to sneak Tibalt into play is going to require our commander, Valky, to be on top of our library. Valky is very cheap to cast at just 2 mana, and is a lightning rod for removal since he exiles the best creature from each opponent's hand until he leaves. When Valky would go to the graveyard, you're going to choose not to replace that by putting him in the command zone. You're going to stick him in the graveyard, and then you're going to put him from the graveyard on top of your library. Several easy ways to do this can be found in Mortuary Mire, Witch's Cottage, and Volrath's Stronghold, 3 useful effects that take up land slots in this deck, and which can all be tutored for by Expedition Map. Non-land ways to do this include Forever Young, and a card I had never heard of before, Haunted Crossroads. Once in play, it repeatedly puts creatures from your graveyard on top of your library for just 1 black mana each time. This is definitely one of the all-stars of the deck. But why do we want Valky on top of our deck, you might ask? Why, for Cascade, of course! Cascade has an extremely beneficial interaction with MDFCs. As you cascade, you check the front face's mana cost. If it qualifies as less than the cascade spell's cost, you can then choose either side to cast without paying its mana cost. With Valky on top of our library, any cascade spell with CMC 3 or higher will let you cast Tibalt for free from the top of your library. How awesome is that? So, once Valky is on top of your deck, cascade into it as Tibalt with Demonic Dread, Throes of Chaos, Volcanic Torrent, or Aurora Phoenix. The first 2 spells don't do a whole lot, but they're cheap to cast. Volcanic Torrent can actually act as a mini board wipe as a bonus, and Aurora Phoenix is a decent flying body that will recur itself when you cascade in future turns. There are also a few cards that do a cascade impression that will work the same way for this deck. Treasure Keeper will cast Valky/Tibalt for free upon dying, Itali Primal Storm lets you cast Tibalt for free off the top upon attacking, and Sunbird's Invocation works as well, but you'll need a card with CMC 7 for that one. Valky and Tibalt are the same card, but not the same spell, so pay close attention to the wordings of cards when it comes to cheating out Tibalt. Keep in mind that these little cascade combos can work with cards other than Valky, so if you have another creature you want back in play, like Sepulchral Primordial, you can still put it on top from the graveyard and cheat it out that same turn for free with something like Itali. There is also a card that lets you cast Tibalt from your hand at instant speed, Electro Dominance. Electro Dominance is worded poorly for Tibalt, unfortunately, so you'll have to cast it for 9 mana, but you will get 7 damage out of it, and the versatility of a removal spell and an instant speed way to cast Tibalt is very enticing. Plus, the element of surprise, coupled with the fact that you'll now have Tibalt in play with access to all your mana to cast opponent's spells on your turn, means it'll be worth your trouble. There are several ways in this deck to get Valky into your hand, and doing so isn't just for Electro Dominance. Having a commander you want to reliably cast that costs 7 mana is going to be rough, but Tibalt always costs 7 when casting him from your hand. Essentially, when playing with this deck, you'll never have to spend more than 7 mana maximum on good old Tibalt, even if you cast him 5 or 6 times. Like I said earlier, the first thing this deck wants to do is cast Valky. Once he's out, there are plenty of ways of returning him to your hand. Command Beacon and Sanctum of Eternity are 2 more utility lands that will help you out when you need them to, while existing as normal normal lands most of the time. As for non-land cards, there is Netherborn Altar, which exists solely to bring Tibalt into your hand at the cost of some life, and Erratic Portal, whose primary goal will be to bounce Valky to your hand, but afterwards it will sit in play and be a disruptive force against any opponent who taps out. Once Valky/Tibalt is in your hand, this deck even has Scroll Rack to put him from your hand on top of your deck, so you can cascade into him for free again. The final way to cast Tibalt ahead of schedule is a fairly simple one, just make a lot of mana. Obviously, this deck has Sol Ring in it, but in addition to that, along with plenty of 2 CMC mana rocks, there is Jeska's Will. Early on, before you cast Tibalt, it can serve as a huge mana boost, allowing you to cast him on turn 4 if an opponent has 6 cards in hand, and that is assuming you haven't ramped otherwise. As a bonus, if you cast Jeska's Will after playing your commander, you'll get to look at and cast 3 cards as well as net some mana. Jeweled Lotus will also contribute 3 mana into casting the Cosmic Imposter, and note that these ritual type effects will put you down a card each time you use them, but as soon as you cast Tibalt and activate his +1, you're getting permanent access to 4 cards, so turboing him out is well worth spending a few cards just to produce mana. It might not seem like much at first glance, but your opponents are quickly going to realize just how great Tibalt is, especially during the early turns when he isn't under any pressure. Jeska's Will has a bigger brother, and we're not talking about Kamal's Will, we're talking about Mana Geyser, and it's going to add a ton of mana to your mana pool. This can either be used for Tibalt or to cast all of the spells he has so kindly stolen for you in the same turn. Finally, there is Geode Golem. All this card has to do is connect with a player, and boom, you get a Tibalt, free of charge. Just note that he does have to be in your command zone, and you will have to pay commander tax. Geode Golem is worded in a favorable way to where it only checks that the card you cast for free is your commander, and thus you can choose the Tibalt side. It can sometimes be tough to deal combat damage, but the Golem does have trample, and it will be very beneficial casting Tibalt while completely untapped. Alright, enough about cheating Tibalt into play. By now, you understand that this deck will always have access to our main man. But once you have him out, how will you protect him to ensure that he can exile as many cards as possible? Well, one of the simplest ways to protect a planeswalker from creatures hitting it is just to put up some blockers. Field of the Dead is a card I can't praise enough in Commander, and those free zombies can go a long way to protecting Tibalt from random creatures on the board that might threaten him. As I mentioned earlier, there is also Expedition Map to tutor for it if you need. Seasoned Pyromancer is here to churn through your library and pitch cards you might not need. It's especially good at throwing away duplicate effects. For example, if you have Erratic Portal out, you can probably discard the Netherborn Altar that's rotting in your hand. If you do, Pyromancer rewards you with 1/1 elemental chump blockers ready to give their lives for Tibalt. Another creature fantastic for deterring attacks is Ophiomancer. Every time a snake blocks and trades for a creature, you get a new one for free during the next upkeep. It kind of makes attacking with a single creature hopeless until Ophiomancer is removed. The classic Planeswalker protection of a board wipe also works, and there are 3 in this deck: Blasphemous Act, Toxic Deluge, and the previously mentioned Volcanic Torrent. Notably, they are all pretty cheap to cast, with the exception being Torrent pulling double duty by letting you cascade into Tibalt. This is so that on big turns, if you really need to pay full price for Tibalt, you can immediately follow up with a board wipe, forcing opponents to use a catch-all spot removal spell or suffer another turn of Tibalt. As for winning the game, it's actually pretty straightforward. If you can activate Tibalt enough times, it really won't be that hard to outvalue opponents with their own card. If you get lucky, you can hit counterspells, extra turn effects, or crucial combo pieces to disrupt opposing strategies. However, we at the Nitpicking Nerds know that any deck needs multiple reliable ways to win, and there are a few more in this deck. The first is a card I've already mentioned, Emrakul the Promised End. I won't go into too much more detail, but Emrakul can do some messed up things to your opponents. One thing she has been known to do is to execute combos of the player she targets, go infinite, kill your opponents, and then force the player whose turn it is to knock themselves out last, leaving you as the winner without doing almost any of the work. Next, there is Sire of Insanity. This card won't straight up win you the game, but this deck can string together play patterns that make future turns hopeless for opponents. Imagine casting Tibalt with Electro Dominance on the last player's end step, or connecting with Geode Golem, or even cascading into Tibalt with stupid Demonic Dread, and following it up with a Sire of Insanity. Now, every player empties their hand, and the primary threat in play is Sire of Insanity, which is preventing them from ever accumulating resources. Meanwhile, Tibalt, the actual biggest threat, gets to keep plussing and stealing cards until Sire is dealt with. The problem for opponents with this sequence is that if they kill Tibalt, you'll just have enough mana to recast him, and Sire of Insanity will still be in play. So lining these two cards up together will go very well for you. You might elicit a group concession after a few turns, especially if Tibalt can exile some groan-worthy cards. And the final backup win condition is something we fall back on quite a bit due to its sheer power. It's Liliana Dreadhorde General. Liliana is seriously one of the strongest planeswalkers in the entire format. Her +1 ability provides great blockers that draw you cards when they die, and the -4 can help to protect Tibalt, but the ultimate ability is what can actually win you the game. Getting there naturally can be extremely difficult, so I've added yet another utility land, Karn's Bastion, to help not only her loyalty, but but Tibalt's as well. Additionally, Yawgmoth Thran Physician works almost as a 2-card combo with Liliana. All you have to do is untap with her, discard a few cards to Yawgmoth, and the game is literally over. I'm not sure any opponent can put up a good fight with just one land, but I've never seen it. Alright, that concludes this brand new Kaldheim deck tech. I predict Tibalt is going to surprise opponents with how annoying he is, stealing their cards over and over again, and this Rakdos deck has a surprising amount of ways to get around that pricey 7 CMC cost as well. I imagine this deck also has a lot of replayability value, since half the cards you cast each game will be randomly chosen from your opponent's decks. If you enjoyed this deck tech, let us know in the comments. We're looking to continue producing these weekly 4th bonus videos in the future with your support. Special shoutouts to all our patrons. You guys make these videos possible, as well as a special shout out to Chimpy for editing this video. And at the end, I just want to give a quick negative shout out to Yehenny's expertise for not cheating out Tibalt and being worded wrong. You stink, and I don't like you. Peace out, Tribe Scout.